Before I read the rest of chapter 23 of A Day of Rest, I wanted to let you know that I've started making my own rose petal beads, and I'm going to show you just a few pictures of the process. Waters made it to the top of the ladder as the sheriff lowered the basket of kittens into the hands of Doug. With a sigh of relief, the deputy agent stepped onto the hay. The dry hay crunched beneath the leather soles and slid. The officer teetered on the edge of the loft for a moment, but was able to regain his balance. No one made the obvious comment about the leather-soled shoes again. The trapdoors were dropped, and the pitching of the hay begun as Doug asked Mr. Lewis if he would like to have a fork too. Mr. Lewis shook his head. "No, you have room for only one amateur up there." Mr. Lewis had seen that look that passed between Douglas and the sheriff. Neither had shown the slightest uneasiness in the search of the loft. It was more like a part of a game. And that was one game Mr. Lewis was having no part in. Mr. McTay could play his joke, and the sheriff could go along with it. There was nothing he could do but pretend ignorance, but there was no need for two federal agents to be made to look foolish. He had worked in hay enough to know that it wasn't fun. Mr. Lewis shook his head again and said that he would check the ground floor while Mr. Waters checked the loft. "You can start by checking the feed room," Douglas suggested as he pulled a key from his pocket and inserted it into the lock. "I always keep it locked, more to prevent the cattle getting in there than to prevent theft. Might be better if I left it open. Wouldn't be so many rats." Douglas took another lantern from the wall and lit it. He held the lantern high as he swung open the door to the feed room. Mr. Lewis took a good look at the face of this suspected moonshiner. The man showed not the least sign of worry. He wasn't trying to bluff his way out of anything. The only emotion Mr. Lewis could detect in that solemn face was suppressed enjoyment, as revealed by the twinkling eyes. That twinkle bothered Mr. Lewis as the door to the feed room swung open. There probably was a surprise for him in that room. Rats? No, the rats would run away when the door swung open. It would have to be something surer than rats to give Mr. McTay that cat swallowed the canary look. A rat trap? A rat trap on the floor that Mr. McTay could maneuver him into? As the two men stepped into the feed room, Mr. Lewis studied the floor carefully, but except for a large wooden box, there was nothing on the floor except sacks of feed. "Go ahead, look around," Douglas encouraged Mr. Lewis. Cautiously, Mr. Lewis lifted the sacks of feed, noticed that they had not been opened yet, and sat them back down on the floor. There was only one other place left to look, the wooden box. Warily, Mr. Lewis approached the box, checking the floor for traps as he advanced, feeling the floor for firmness before shifting his weight. There was something here in that room. Mr. McTay had forced his face into an absolute blank, but had not been able to stop his eyes from sparkling with suppressed excitement as Mr. Lewis neared the wooden box. Mr. Lewis reached back and pulled Douglas forward so the lantern would give direct light into the box. As the light shone into the box, a long black object dug itself into the feed. A sleek black head reappeared instantly and issued a warning hiss. "Go ahead, check the feed," Doug invited with a wide grin. "The snake won't hurt you unless you get it cornered. I must admit, though, I always flinch when it hisses at me as I reach down into that box. I do a lot of rattling around first to give it time to get out of the way. Even then, I always use a long-handled scoop." "Why don't you do something about it?" "I did. I imported the snake to keep the rats out." "Why don't you use a trap for the rats?" "I've tried every kind of trap that's on the market, from the spring traps to the heavy gauge box kind. With each trap, I catch only one rat, and that will always be a young one. Most of the time, I see only a little blood where a rat has been caught and then gnawed itself out." "What about the cats?" "The cats are too small to catch these rats. They are good for mice, but these rats are large enough to kill the cats." "But snakes?" Mr. Lewis shook his head in disgust. "Snakes are the best thing for rats. They will hunt the rats back to their nests. I put a few out here and some at the house and the outbuildings, but I need more snakes to put down at the entrance to some mines. Until I get rid of the rats at the mines, there's no possibility of getting rid of the rats here at the barn or at the house." "Won't the snakes bite?" "Yes, if they're cornered, black snakes bite, but they ain't poisonous." "I think I would rather just have rats as snakes." "I wouldn't," Doug disagreed. "Black snakes don't double their number every 6 weeks, winter and summer. The snakes take only what they need for food. They don't ruin everything in sight by gnawing on it. Furthermore," Doug added as he turned toward the door, "the snakes are not as dangerous as rats, since the snakes don't run in packs." Shaking his head doubtfully, Mr. Lewis followed Douglas out of the feed room. Under that feed would be a good place to hide something, but it would take a brave man to run his hands through the bran to check. Mr. Lewis counted himself a brave man, but not a foolish one. He didn't think that there was anything hid in the feed or anywhere else. "No," Mr. Lewis said emphatically when Doug suggested that he should check the cow stalls, and followed behind as Doug led him out of the barn toward the chicken house. He had lost all interest in this hunt from the moment the sheriff sat down in the living room and let them search without his help. A sheriff would want to take credit for finding any contraband in his county. Although the sheriff was now helping search the hayloft, he had shown quite clearly that he thought the search was a farce. The pitching of hay in the loft continued without pause as Doug and Mr. Lewis left the barn. The sheriff called a halt as he paused to catch the mother cat, who had gradually eased herself down to the floor of the loft and was sniffing around in the hay for her kittens. After the mother cat was dropped down to the ground beside the basket containing her kittens, the work continued. Mr. Waters pitched the hay with caution, checking each forkful before he pitched the hay through the drop to the shed. The sheriff, however, made no effort to check the hay for contraband before pitching it. When Mr. Waters objected, the sheriff stated that since they were looking for bottles, they didn't have to worry. The bottles would clink as the fork hit them. Waters accepted the explanation eagerly and stopped his probing with the fork. Soon he was making no effort to separate the hay into forkfuls, to be lifted and tossed, but he began to wildly push a heap of hay across toward the trap doors. The hay snagged and caught on the rough floor of the loft, leaving clumps along the floor. Mr. Waters pushed and tugged, stumbling on the clumps, slipping on the broken bits, sliding in the dust, finally falling to his knees as the hay jammed at the trap door. Mr. Waters walked on his knees across the hay and, leaning forward, thrust his fork into the clump of hay. He held the fork close to his body as he shoved the hay on through the opening. His method was effective. The hay gave way almost at once. As the hay began to slide, Mr. Waters was still on his knees. He made an effort to stand up, but his shoes were too slippery. He merely fell sideways as the hay slid forward through the trap door. The sheriff reached over and took the pitchfork from the agent's hand as the surprised officer slid through the trap. Then, standing his own fork and Mr. Waters' fork against the wall of the loft, the sheriff descended the ladder to the ground. Sure that the federal officers would no longer be interested in investigating the hay or the loft again, the sheriff began brushing hay from his pants as he walked toward the gate.